Okay, let me have the pleasure to introduce LVH, and he'll be talking about Crypto 101, the underlying, the basics of security, and over to you, LVH.
I'm LVH. If you want to get in touch with me or heckle me or tell me I'm wrong, I'm at LVH on Twitter, and anything at lvh.io is likely to get in my inbox. First of all, let's start with the lightning talk version of this talk. If your data is in motion, please use TLS. So that means if you're transferring it right now, use TLS. If you're storing data or you want to sign data or anything like that, please use GPG. There's a couple of options that you also have that aren't entirely broken and that are probably good because they've been written by real cryptographers and they try to expose an API that's really hard to get wrong. So that would be NACL, or pronounced SALT apparently, because we haven't had enough things yet that's called SALT. Apparently, very recently, there's a PyNACL, so it's actually easy to use from Python now. Keystar or cryptlib. The problem with these is if you want to use these, then it's sort of likely that you're trying to get too involved, which means that there's too many things that you potentially could get wrong. So please mostly remember TLS GPG. If you're typing the letters AES into your code, you are doing it wrong. If you're typing the letters DES into your code, you're doing it extra wrong. And if you're typing the letters MD5 or SHA into your code, then you might be wrong. So why should you still stay, given the fact that I've just pretty much told all the important things in this talk? Well, recognizing wrong stuff still matters. I mean, it's still important that you can actually go to coworkers that are trying to implement password stores or whatever and go like, no, no, don't do this. And understanding stuff still matters. I mean, it's still handy to have like at least some vague understanding of what goes on with crypto, even if it's just to tickle your own curiosity. But if you're building systems like this or you're involved in a system like this, it's nice to sort of know what's going on. The other reason is because otherwise it's sort of like when someone asks you, hey, I would like a blog, and the answer is use Python, which is like technically correct and also completely useless. Now, this talk is going to start from very, very, very meager beginnings. And when I say that, I literally mean XOR. So for those who don't know, is there anyone who doesn't know what XOR is? OK, cool. So I can skip those slides. So, and it's basically a programmable inverter. You know, when either you have let's say that the input is 1, and you either you put the inversion to 1, then the output would be 0. If you don't invert, then the output would be 1. What can we do with this? We can make a one-time pad. What's a one-time pad? It's a very, very, very long string of random 1s and 0s. What can we do with that? Well, you take your input text, you run it through the one-time pad, and you get some output. Now, it turns out that this has perfect secrecy. Why? Because let's say that an attacker reads the ciphertext and he sees a 1. That means that he has no idea whether that was originally a 1 that didn't get inverted or originally a 0 that did get inverted. So here's an example of a one-time pad. It's very boring. It's white noise. And here's an example of something that was encrypted with that one-time pad. And if you can see that there's only a couple of differences. And only when you overlay the two can you see that it's actually the PyCon logo. So victory, yes, again, the talk is over. This is the second time that I've ended the talk in 3 minutes. You know, crypto is over. We can all go home. We just use one-time pads for everything. Except we don't. Why not? Well, what's the length of a one-time pad? Well, it's the length of all data that you're going to send ever. Because clearly, if you repeat the one-time pad, then this property of, you know, you have no idea whether that was a 1 or a 0 originally doesn't hold, because you can do statistical analysis, for example, to see what sort of messages you're getting. Now, obviously, the length of all data ever is a very, very big number, which kind of makes key exchange pretty difficult. I mean, so there are practical applications of one-time pads, but this is clearly not something that we can actually use on the real internet. So what do we use instead? Ciphers. For example, block ciphers. Block cipher is a very simple thing that takes a key, it takes some plain text of a fixed size, and it outputs some ciphertext of the same fixed size. And this is called a bijection. So for every possible input under a given key, there's exactly one output, and that one output only maps to that particular input. Another way of calling this is random permutation. This is an example of a very, very small block cipher. So basically, for every possible combination of 3 bits, there's exactly one of them on the left side, and exactly the same one occurs exactly once on the other side. The main interesting property that you get from a block cipher is simply that knowing one plain text and its encrypted version doesn't tell you anything about any other such tuple. So that means that, for example, in the graphical example, if you know one of the arrows, you don't really know anything else about any of the other arrows. What are good block ciphers to use? AES. It's pretty much the only, it's called the advanced encryption standard for a reason. Well, that's not always true. I mean, we also have wired equivalent privacy, which doesn't really count. But this is seriously the only one you could use. Blowfish and twofish are also fine, but there's no real reason to use them unless you want to be all hipstery about your crypto and you just want to use something else because it's different, and in which case, talk to a cryptographer. Don't use DES or triple DES. They're just completely broken. They only exist in like hardware from the 80s and 90s or something. And yeah, don't do it ever. So now, victory, yes, we have small keys because the keys for most block ciphers are fairly small. And now we can encrypt things like hello, and I can turn it into a ciphertext. I can send you to ciphertext, and nobody can reasonably get back to hello from the ciphertext. And then I try to send you an image, and it blows up. Why? Because it's a block cipher. And the length of the message, in this case the image, is probably a lot bigger than the block size. To give you an idea, the block size of AES is generally 128 bits, and that's 16 bytes. That's not very big. That's not much of an image. So instead, we have stream ciphers. Now, there is such a thing as a native stream cipher, so basically something that's designed to be a stream cipher. The most common example of that is probably RC4. It's also famous for pretty much being broken, and unfortunately also being responsible for a lot of the TLS traffic that goes on the internet right now. So yeah, don't use that. There's a couple of good stream ciphers. They're somewhat less used. These are two that DGB, Dan Bernstein, who's a cryptographer, made. Most stream ciphers have sort of been fraught with all sorts of mishaps, and we don't really have a lot of good ones. Now, that doesn't really matter, because it turns out that you can build a stream cipher by having some kind of construction with block ciphers. And these constructions are generic, and they can be applied with different block ciphers. So you just have this generic construction, you plug in a block cipher, and then magically you have something sort of like a stream cipher. So how could we do that? Well, the trivial approach that you might want to take is, well, we can encrypt individual blocks, but we can't encrypt a stream. So how about we just take the stream, we chop it into blocks, and we encrypt each individual block, and then we just append the ciphertext, and then we have a block cipher. So other people have thought of this. This is called ECB mode. And the biggest problem with ECB mode is that obviously the same plaintext chunk will always map to the same ciphertext chunk, because there's nothing changing with your block cipher. If you're encrypting AAA now and you're encrypting AAA at the end of the stream, it's going to be encrypted to exactly the same thing. Why is that a problem? Well, let's go back to our PyCon logo, and I've encrypted this with well, it's a mock block cipher, but this is a block cipher with a block size of 5 pixels. So if it's a bitmap with 3-channel RGB at 1 byte per channel, that's 15 bytes per block. So this is basically what AES would roughly look like, because AES would be 16 bytes per block. This is 15 bytes per block. I think we can all agree that doesn't really count as a very suitable form of encryption. I can certainly still read what that says. Even if you up the block size to 50, it's slightly less legible, but clearly not good. And this is just for a simple visual example. Cryptographers can do much more interesting things because, well, they know certain things. For example, if they know that they're expecting a SQLite database, well, then they know, well, there's going to be these bytes there and these bytes there, and they can already learn all sorts of interesting things about things that you're trying to encrypt. Clearly, if we have some kind of good encryption, then it should look roughly like this, like random noise. Keep in mind, just because it does look like random noise doesn't mean that it's good encryption. But if it's good encryption, then it should look like random noise. One other reason that this is terrible is replay attacks. And apparently there's an example of a game that had this problem. What's a replay attack? Let's say that there is some kind of very exclusive party, which I'm clearly not invited to because it's very exclusive. And I spend a lot of time in Poland these days, so I hear that people going up to the door, knock knock, bouncer asks what's the password, and these people say Vucnik. Now, I might have no idea that that's Polish for swordfish, but I don't need to know that that's Polish for swordfish because I can just repeat the thing that they just said that I don't necessarily understand myself and get exactly the same privileges that they get. That is, they let me in. So a replay attack is basically any attack where you take something that you saw before and you simply repeat it or replay it. So block cipher modes of operation, these are these generic forms that I was talking about earlier. So it's some kind of construction, and you take a block cipher, plug the block cipher in there, and out comes something more or less like a stream cipher. Here's a couple of examples of block cipher mode of operation. So ECB is the terrible one that I demoed earlier, so the one that makes something that kind of looks exactly the same. CBC is one that I'm going to talk about shortly, and CTR is one that I'm going to talk about shortly. CBC is probably the most common one in the wild. You may have heard about it, or you might be able to find a lot about it recently because it's the thing that was in the Beast attacks. I don't know, has anyone heard about the Beast attacks on TLS? No? A couple of people? Okay. So basically, TLS being probably one of the most reviewed crypto systems in the world, well, it tends to get problems in it found. And one of the problems that it had was, so the Beast attack, I'm not going to go into the precise details. It's not so much a problem with CBC itself as it was a problem with the particular way that TLS used CBC. This only goes to show that crypto is hard, don't do it yourself. Entire teams of cryptographers get this wrong. So yeah, Beast attack. If you're interested, you can find a ton of stuff about this on Google. CTR, short for counter mode. How does it work? Really simple. You take a nonce, so that's basically just a tiny random number. Well, not very tiny, but and a count. So for example, the nonce here is the D5013202, and the count starts at 0 and keeps incrementing. What do you do then? You encrypt each of these blocks. Now, if you remember what I said earlier, what does a block cipher get you? Well, if you know one of the, if you change the input, then probably the output's going to be pretty different. And if you know input-output pairs, then you don't necessarily learn much about other input-output pairs. So in this case, you get these seemingly random-looking numbers at the bottom, and so these seemingly random looking numbers at the bottom, and that's called a keystream. And you use that sort of like you would in a one-time pad. So you take the keystream and you XOR it with your input, and then whatever you get out of that XOR, that's what you send onto the wire. So you get the same guarantees as one-time pad, provided that this stream cipher, you had some magical stream cipher that produced really, truly random numbers. Any real stream cipher has a slightly weaker is of course slightly weaker because it's not completely random numbers, but ideally they should be equally good, or at least close enough that any real attacker isn't going to be able to tell the difference. There's a couple of other modes. These are slightly more advanced. These are called authenticating encryption modes. Why? Because they don't just encrypt, they will also authenticate. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. The most interesting one of these is probably GCM, also probably the most commonly used, I think. Problem with a lot of these is that they're like patented for things that aren't even really that fancy or innovative. So GCM is probably the most used one. One of the reasons is that it's not patent encumbered. So yeah, victory. I mean, we're done. We can send messages of arbitrary size, and they're totally safe. And we're done. Except key exchange. How are we going to exchange keys? I still need to agree with you on a secret key that we both put into the the stream cipher, so that we can actually communicate securely. Well, one way to do that would be in person. Now, of course, the problem is that if you have a lot of actors, then, well, especially like on the internet, you have, almost infinite actors. That's going to be an O of n squared problem. That's not really going to work. So instead, I'm going to tell you about something called Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And this is basically a way of agreeing with two people over an insecure channel, such as the internet, agreeing on a shared secret. How do you do that? Well, I'm going to explain it with an analogy using colors. Of course, normally this works using numbers, but then I have to explain a bunch of math, and that would take too long. So instead, I'm just going to explain it using colors. There's a couple of simple things I can do with colors. I can mix them, It doesn't matter which order I mix them in. And very importantly, I can't subtract them. So for example, green could be made with blue and yellow, but it also could be made with infinite other combinations. So there's no way, given one other color, like, what's the remnant? So this is our model. I have me on the left. I have the internet filled with evil hackers in the middle. And I have the person that I'm trying to communicate with, you, well, one single instance of you, and on the right. So we start with a public secret. And we just send that over the wire. We just agree on the public secret. That's the thing that everybody knows, even the attackers. Then I pick my own little secret. And I add those, and I get my own mixed color. You do the same thing. You pick your own little secret, and you get your mixed color. So remember, at this point, you know your secret and your mixed color. I know my secret, my mixed color. Everybody knows the public secret. Other than that, the internet knows nothing. Then I will send you my mixed color. You will send me your mixed color. So we're sending the mixed colors across the internet. Now, that means that the attacker can see the mixed colors. So if you can, at the top there, I'm listing all the things that the attacker knows. The attacker knows the mixed color. But remember, you can't subtract colors. So even despite the fact that he knows the public thing and the shared thing, that doesn't mean that he can get to any of our secrets. So what do we do next? Well, I add my secret color to it again, and I get this brownie thing. And you add your secret color to it again, and you get the exact same brown color. Huh, why? Well, if you remember, I said that it didn't matter in which order you added colors. So if you do public thing plus my secret plus your secret, then it's going to be exactly the same thing as public thing plus your secret plus my secret. So in the end, we end up with the same shared secret, and we didn't actually have to put anything on the wire that can be used to get that secret. So this is all based, of course, based on the idea that it's hard to subtract colors. This translates to something to a mathematical problem that we believe is hard. If it turns out that this mathematical problem is not hard, then, well, we're kind of screwed. But for now, it seems that seems to be holding up. But whatever. So victory, we can all go home because we have stream ciphers, and we can get keys, we can get secret keys over the unencrypted internet, and we can communicate safely. Except, of course, there's this problem. How do I know that when I'm talking to you that I'm actually talking to you? What prevents an attacker from doing this Diffie-Hellman dance with me thinking that it's actually you, acquiring some secret key, then doing the same Diffie-Hellman dance with you thinking that it's actually me? And so the attacker has a key, shares a key with me, the attacker shares a key with you. We don't share anything, that is me and you. And when I send something to the attacker, it's perfectly encrypted. It's entirely secure over the wire. The attacker decrypts it, can read it, because obviously he has a secret key, and he just sends a completely different message to you. And there's no way for us to fix it. And what actually makes it even worse is there's no way that I could convince you that I'm actually me and you're talking to an attacker, because I'm just some random guy with some random secret that you've never heard of, and the attacker is the guy who has the thing that actually checks out and that actually works. So that's a bit of a problem. That means we're lacking authenticity. We have no idea that the sender is in fact who we expect it is, and that the message is in fact what we expect it is. Now, as a corollary, encryption without authentication is almost certainly wrong. There's one tiny edge case where if you're signing it at some later point where it might be okay, but at that point you need to hire a cryptographer. So in general, please remember, if you're encrypting, then you really, really need to authenticate, always. If you think you don't, you're probably wrong. For example, an example of this is that attackers don't actually need to be able to understand what you're saying, as in be able to decrypt the ciphertext, in order to successfully modify it to say something else. They might have to try a lot of times, because a lot of times the message is going to be nonsense, but turns out that there's a lot of attacks where attackers really do get to try millions and millions and millions of times, and they only have to get it right once. So how can we do authenticated encryption? Well, there's authenticated encryption modes. For example, GCM that I mentioned earlier. So that's one of those standard constructions. You plug in a block cipher, and you end up with a form of authenticated encryption. And the other way is message authentication codes, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. First, I need to explain cryptographic hash functions. What's a hash function? Well, it's something that takes a message of roughly arbitrary size, and it produces a digest, also sometimes called state, of usually fixed size. And what else does a hash function promise? That computing it is very, very, very cheap, ideally free. So the cheaper the better. And also, if you know a hash, then it's extremely hard, if not impossible, to generate a message. So you can't go the other way. You can go from a message to a hash. You can't go from a hash back to a message. Also, if you change the message, then with overwhelming probability, you will change the hash. And not only will you change the hash like a tiny bit, it will generally change enormously. And thirdly, it's very hard to find two messages that will end up with the same hash. It's even if you know one message, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can figure out a different message that will end up having the same hash. That's it. For example, a hash function says nothing about being able to compute some related, the hash value of some related message. For example, a typical example of this is extension attacks. So for example, let's say that you have a hash function. This is roughly this is actually the API that you have in Python. I'm going to introduce a little bit extra API in a little bit because I'm doing evil things that Python doesn't allow you to do by default. But I have a hash function, and it says, hello, PyCon, how are you doing? And then I get the hex digest. Now, let's say that I'm trying to impersonate you, and you thought that the hex digest was a valid way of saying, yes, this is truly the message. Well, what I can do is I can take your hash, and I add my own string, and then I take the hex digest, and it'll all just work, because I'm just adding things, and this is something that most hash functions support. So for example, my string could be like, hi, PyCon, I'm not attending because I've switched to PHP. A good example of this recently that I came across is a payment processor that I had to deal with. Now, their way of signing a transaction was you have a shared secret that you get when you sign up, and that's supposed to be securely delivered, by which they mean unencrypted in an email, but whatever. So let's just say that they got that part right. And then you append the amount in cents. So if it's $12, then you append 1,200. You hash that, you attach that, and I see that there's a cryptographer in the front row who already knows what the next slide's going to be, and he's laughing. That means, of course, what I do is I can take the hash from something else, and then I append 12 zeros, and suddenly instead of signing something for $1, you've signed something for all of the dollars. So yes, clearly, this is a payment processor. So I'm presuming that at some point somebody must have looked at this and went, "What?" But no, seriously, these people are doing real transactions on real credit cards with this. Anyway, this is not at all. This is not at all obscure. You can download things off of GitHub that will do this for you, that it's simply designed to do this. bwall/hashpump does this. Now, I've been told that in the SHA-3 era, this is no longer the case. So basically, the output that you get when you do hex digest, or the equivalent of hex digest, is not entirely the internal state of the hash function. So that means that you can no longer do nasty tricks like length extension attacks. That being said, it's not really a bug that, like SHA-2, everybody knew about length extension attacks when SHA-2 was designed. This was just not considered a problem because if you're exposed to a length extension attack, you're doing it wrong. So, what should you use? SHA-256, SHA-3, both are fine. One of the problems that was raised when they were trying to pick SHA-3 was that they were sort of expecting SHA-2 to blow up faster, and it's kind of fine. There's no real problems that we know of. So if you use SHA-256, there's really nothing wrong, so please carry on. There's another one that might be sort of interesting if you, so this is made by a friend of mine called Zuko. and a couple of other people. But it has the interesting property that it should be roughly as secure in the cryptographic hash function sense as the other SHA-3 contestants. But, or actually, no, Blake was a SHA-3 contestant, not Blake 2. But it is significantly faster. So if for some reason you're doing something where the performance really matters, turns out that Blake 2 is faster. But then again, you shouldn't be implementing your own crypto, so forget everything I just said. This brings us to max, because remember that I just said, you know, if the hash of a message can be used to compute the hash of a related message. And that's not really a bug. I mean, that's just the hash function doing what it says on the tin. Now, MAC says absolutely nothing. So a MAC is it stands for Message Authentication Code. It's a thing that takes a secret key and a message, and it gives you some value. And the nice thing is that if you try to do the same thing with the same key and a related message, you don't learn anything about the other. Similarly, you also don't learn anything about related messages. Unrelated messages. Probably the only real one that you should ever, well, I mean, there's other options, but by far, probably the simplest and most accessible one is HMAC, which is based on a hash function. So it basically takes a key, hash function, and a message. Why is it most accessible? Because we're a PyCon, and it turns out that you can just do import HMAC, and you magically get HMAC implementations. Please don't try to implement HMAC yourself. I mean, use Python, import HMAC. It's good enough. Now, that brings me to password storage. I don't know if anyone's ever seen my lightning talk at EuroPython, or I think I've done it at other places as well. This is one of my favorite spiels. It gets me very angry. This is why this is the only bold-faced and italic and underlined thing in the entire talk. But cryptographic hash functions for password storage are wrong. If your password store uses SHA-2 or, God forbid, MD5 or any other hash function, it's broken. It's just broken. Why is it broken? Well, most people think it's not broken because, hey, let's say that the attacker steals the database. They have all of these outputs of a hash function. Now, you can't go back to the password because that's what the hash function says it would do. You can't go back to the password from, given a hash, you can't go back to the message that provided that hash, or you can't generate a message that provided that hash. But what about brute force? I mean, why don't we just try a lot of passwords? Because, I mean, I can buy things like this, which has like roughly the air displacement and noise of a household vacuum cleaner. Oh, and by the way, it computes like stupid amounts of MD5 and SHA-2 hashes per second. So if I'm not mistaken, this would be 5.6 billion in English MD5 hashes per second and 2.3 billion SHA-2 hashes per second. This is data from 2 years ago. I mean, the state of the art has advanced somewhat, but it turns out that ATI really did really well with that video card. But my point is, it's really easy to try tons of passwords, so SHA's broken. The other thing is that with Bitcoin, regardless of what you actually think of Bitcoin, Bitcoin has made it extremely, so for those who don't know, Bitcoin is essentially a currency based on cryptography. Now, it turns out that internally, the way Bitcoin works, it uses a lot of SHA-2. This means that there's been incredibly huge amounts of money invested in making SHA-2 fast. But essentially, yeah, you can't possibly try to encrypt passwords with SHA-2 because I'm just going to try tons and tons and tons of passwords, and eventually one of them is going to be right. So how about SHA-3? Well, remember that I told you this is what a hash function is supposed to do. You're supposed to be able to go in, oh, yeah, it's mirrored for you guys, that direction. So you're supposed to be able to go from plain text to the hash really, 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 really quickly. And SHA-3 is a better hash than SHA-2, so it's faster. So on Ivy Bridge and Sandy Bridge, SHA-2 is about 14 cycles a byte, and SHA-3 is 11 cycles a byte. So SHA-3 does not make this problem better. SHA-3 makes this problem worse. Why does it make it worse? Because the attack was never about attacking the hash function. It was about attacking simply getting lots of input for the hash function and computing them and verifying them. Salts. Well, salts don't really help one bit because by the time, so what's a salt? Does anyone not know what a salt is? Okay, so what's a salt? Instead of hashing the password, what people would do is they would add a random number of sufficient length to the start or end or whatever of the password before hashing it. Why would you want to do that? Well, back in the olden days, we had a thing called dictionary attacks. What's a dictionary attack? The idea was if people have passwords that are stored with MD5, well, I could just compute a lot of MD5s and like keep them on like a DVD or a bunch of hard drives or whatever. And then when I get the password database, I can look it up, kind of like a hash table. I could just look up the hash that's in the database, and then I can see what password generated that. Now, it turns out, like I said earlier, that's not the way modern attacks on password databases don't work anymore. So it worked for an attack in the 90s that's completely irrelevant now, so it has nothing to do. I mean, there's no reason to use it anymore. So salts really don't work at all anymore. The other reason is that if an attacker has compromised your database, sometimes people say, well, it's okay because an attacker can't access the salt. Well, they already accessed your password database, which isn't supposed to happen, so the attacker's already clearly gotten into your database. Is it really that unreasonable to believe that they can also read your salt? Usually, no. Now, what should you use instead? You should use a key derivation function, or KDF. What's the fundamental difference between a cryptographic hash function and a KDF? Well, the most important one is that a hash function is best when it's extremely fast. A KDF should be bog slow, should be as slow as humanly possible. Should be, well, actually, computerly possible, but should be as slow as possible that your users will still put up with it. That's the optimal level for a KDF. What sort of KDFs are there? And a good example is bcrypt. Why is bcrypt nice? It was one of the first one, if I'm not mistaken, that is tunably time hard. What does that mean? You can configure how much time it takes to compute a bcrypt hash, or bcrypt key. So if, let's say that 10 years from now, computers are way faster, that's okay. You just bump this number up a little bit, and then it'll take longer to compute, and we're still good. Now, the one that is state-of-the-art is called scrypt. It's made by a very clever cookie who's the security officer for FreeBSD. His name is Colin Percival. He makes tarsnap. If you want a secure backup thing, I recommend you look at it. It's great. So scrypt is nice because it's tunably time and space hard. So that means that not only do you take a lot of time to compute it, you also need a lot of memory to compute it. It turns out that particularly GPU-based attacks are completely crippled by this memory hard requirement. Because, well, relatively speaking, GPUs are able to perform many, many, many orders of magnitude more instructions, but they don't necessarily have many, many, many orders of magnitude more RAM. So you basically run out of space. You can't compute scrypt, so this completely breaks that attack as well. So this is state of the art. If you absolutely must design a password database, you shouldn't design a password database. But if you absolutely must, please use scrypt. Now, earlier, I had the problem of sender authentication. If you remember, I had the attacker in the middle, and he did Diffie-Hellman with me, and he got a secret key, and the attacker did Diffie-Hellman with you, and he got a secret key with you. Clearly, the problem is that I should be able to identify, hey, hang on, you're not who you claim to be, you're evil hacker. So how do we do that? Oh, actually, I had slides for this. Oops. One way of doing this is public key cryptography. Actually, that's pretty much the way of doing it. What's public key cryptography? Essentially, in all of the examples up until now, we've had a single key, and both sides have the same key. So it's symmetrical. That's why it's called symmetric key cryptography. Public key cryptography can also be called asymmetric key cryptography because you have each person has two keys, and they're not the same. You have a public key, you have a private key. The public key is, like it says, public. You spread it all over the world, and it allows people to communicate with you. Now, actually, Diffie-Hellman, which I talked about earlier, is an example of a public key protocol because the yellow thing that was shared with the entire world is a public key, and these things that are secret and should remain secret or else it all falls apart could be called secret keys. So key generation is something incredibly cheap. Who does not have SSH on their machine? There we go, everyone. So that means that almost certainly at some point you have done key generation already, even though maybe you didn't really know it. But if you do, I can't remember, SSH-keygen? Yes, SSH-keygen, then you generate a key. So this is extremely simple, and even the most wimpy laptop can do this pretty trivially. So like I said, everyone has a pair of keys. And in my slides, the red keys are secret or private, and the green keys are public. Now, this has the nice property. I have a cloud on my slides because everything is in the cloud. Yay, cloud. So everyone can just put their public keys everywhere, and that's fine, because there's absolutely nothing interesting that an attacker can do using a public key. And this actually happens. For example, with GPG, there are key servers, and people upload their keys to them, and that way you can find keys for people that you want to talk with. So what does encryption look like? It's very similar in a way to the slides from symmetric encryption, or stream cipher or block cipher encryption. But the main difference is that instead of taking the symmetric key, you have the public key. So for example, you take hello world, it goes through public key encryption, it takes a public key, and out comes, well, noise, or well, at least ciphertext. So how does decryption look like? Pretty much the same thing, except again, critical difference. The key is the different key. It's the private key that you actually use to decrypt. Now, signing. Signing is something that I talked about earlier. We need to be able to actually verify that the thing that the message that I'm sending is in fact the message that I intended to send. And it's not good enough to just encrypt it because, like I said, even if it's encrypted, I might still be able to modify the ciphertext, and maybe the thing that comes out at the end is still a sensible message. It just happens to be not what you intended. So how can we sign? Well, so anyone can use my public key, but how do I know that you're you? How do we sign? Well, for example, you can take a hash function of your message, and this is somewhat confusing. You pretend that the hash function is actually already encrypted. You decrypt it with, obviously, a private key. You end up with a signature, and I append the signature to my message. And then on the other side, when you try to read my thing, you use my public key to encrypt it, and you get back the hash function of the message, which you can trivially verify because you just compute it yourself, and you check that the two are the same number. What you use for this, by far, the biggest one is RSA. I mean, there are other public key encryption algorithms, but yeah, by far the most common in use is RSA. So yeah, I mean, victory. We can all go home. Me is actually me. Hey, wait, actually, how do we know that? I mean, I put a public key on the internet, but how do you know that if you find a public key on some key server somewhere, how do you know that's me? So unless I'm actually physically near you at some point and hand you the key, how do you know who's who? Well, one way of doing that is chains of signatures. I mean, I don't trust you, but this other person trusts you. And I trust that other person. So therefore, I trust you. So basically, it's a way of saying, well, even though you haven't personally met that person, someone else has, and he vouches to say, yes, that key is really that guy. And because you trust that signature from that other person, therefore, yes, you also trust that that key is that guy. So that's the way GPG key signing generally works. And the final bit of this talk is where I take SSL, which is production encryption, the thing that you use daily in your browser. Usually, well, when people say SSL, they generally mean TLS, because SSL is the old name for it, which is from way back when, which you definitely don't want to use. TLS is the new and improved thing, which is essentially just a new version of the old thing. And I'm going to primarily be talking about the way that it's implemented in your browser, not because that's the most interesting implementation, but that's because that's the one that you probably all care about. So how does it work? Well, you try to connect to a server, and you start by telling it which version of TLS you support, and specifically which cipher suites that you support. What's a cipher suite? It's basically the encryption algorithms that you support, or not even, sorry, the algorithms that you support, not just encryption. First of all, you agree on a key exchange method, for example, RSA or Diffie-Hellman. You agree on a signing algorithm. So RSA signing works the way I explained it before, and the other one, well, DSA does too. The last one is based on elliptic curves. That's somewhat more advanced. You're unlikely to see it on the real internet very often unless you visit cryptographers' websites. You agree on a bulk encryption algorithm, so that's the thing that's going to actually turn most of your data into encrypted data. And finally, you agree on a message authentication algorithm, which is going to verify that the things that you send are actually what you want it to send. And so the server replies. It will send the version that it supports and its cipher suites, and it will also send the certificate. And that certificate is the little thing down there. At that point, hopefully, your client checks the certificate. I do say hopefully. If I'm not mistaken, the SSL implementation that comes with the Python standard library by default does not check certificates. So that means that if I pretend to be Google, then you can totally set up a secure connection with me, and I'm Google, right? What happens then? I pick a random secret. I encrypt it with the server's public key. I get some encrypted text, and I send it to the server. And the server then decrypts it using their private key, and they will get the same random secret that I sent them, obviously. And then, using the same random secret, we can derive keys. In this case, I said AES because bulk encryption algorithm was too long to fit in the tiny little box, but AES is just one example. So you derive the bulk encryption key, you derive the MAC key, and then finally you use the MAC key to verify that all of the things in the handshake were in fact what you wanted to say. That's minor, well, it's an important detail, but it's not as important as the other ones. So, and then at that point you have an encrypted and authenticated link, and you can just send things over that. I unfortunately, due to the length of this talk, I will not have time for questions here, but there will be an open space immediately adjoining. So anyway, I did sort of hand-wavily say, check that certificate, and hopefully you do, even though if you're using Python standard library, you're probably not. But how does that work? I mean, how does it happen that an attacker can't just pretend to be Google, unless you're using the Python standard library? Well, generally, TLS relies on a system of certificate authorities. How does that work? You have one very important person at the top, and he signs other slightly less important people's certificates, and they sign slightly less important people's certificates. And eventually, you get some certificates sent to your browser that you can then check. How do you check it? Well, you know someone up the chain, and you just follow the chain until you get to a certificate that you know. For example, this is what my browser says for Wikipedia. I hope I wasn't man in the middle while I was doing this. So you start with wikipedia.org. I don't know wikipedia.org. My computer has never heard of wikipedia.org. But Wikipedia does have a certificate that is signed by DigiCert High Assurance CA3. Now, my computer also has no idea what that is. But that certificate is signed by DigiCert High Assurance EV Root CA. Computer also has no idea what that is, but that is signed by GTE CyberTrust Global Root, and it turns out that I have GTE CyberTrust Global Root in my computer that was shipped with my computer. Most of you will have it shipped with your computer, so in something that comes with your operating system. And you already know that public key, so you can verify that signature, and you know, therefore, that the second thing is legit, and the third thing is legit, and the final thing is legit. So we're all good. Of course, the problem is, just because something is valid doesn't necessarily mean that it's trustworthy. Now, I hate to be all McCarthyian about this, but you know, the China Internet Network Information Anyway, I think that there's a good reason why this thing is, maybe it's because the acronym is CYNIC, I don't know, but I mean, it's valid, but is it trustworthy? I mean, these people are at least about one hop removed from people that, like, we know were injecting malware into people's computers. And the thing is, because they are a valid root certificate installed on my machine, that means that if they want to pretend to be Google, or they want to pretend to be my bank, then Firefox is not going to complain. Well, actually, in the case of Google, it does, but that's a different story. So we've sort of addressed this issue in Chrome. And I think in Firefox as well, yeah. So, and I mean, I'm from Belgium. I mean, my computer apparently trusts the Belgian root CA. I wouldn't trust Belgium, seriously. No. Also, what if I plant a root cert? And what if I install a root certificate on your computer? This is totally common practice in enterprise environments. Using a thing, and this, you don't even really need to do anything interesting. There's a plugin for a proxy called Squid, called SSL Bump, where basically all of the, you connect to the proxy basically just fakes whatever certificate you want, and then actually sets up the secure encryption with the remote thing. So it's really easy to man in the middle this, provided that you actually control the device that the person is using. And you can then modify that and just make it say whatever you want. I built a proxy once called Minitrue that is basically based on the idea, hey, what if your proxy's lying to you? So, and I think that's it, because I don't have time for it. So I have a couple of extra slides. I want to do them at the open space if anyone's interested. I'd like to talk about timing attacks and side channel attacks, or whatever you guys have for questions. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, sorry, we are running out of time.
44 minutes and 58 seconds. Talk about timing.
Cool. So one quick announcement, please. So I've been told that some people